And I'd like to welcome Charlie Knight, who's going to be giving today's presentation. And I'll turn it over to Charlie, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. Enjoy.
All right. Thanks, Ray. Good morning, everybody. My name's Charlie Knight. I'm the Curator of Military History here at the North Carolina Museum of History. And this morning, I want to give you kind of a brief glimpse into our newest exhibit that's going to be opening in a couple of weeks called Answering the Call. It's going to be our newest military-themed exhibit, and some of you might be familiar or remember our previous military exhibit, A Call to Arms. This will be kind of similar to that, but also different from that in its own way. So it's not a rehash of previous exhibits, I guess is the best way to put it. It's going to open on April 6th, and I hope most, if not all of you, will be able to join us. And just a couple of things in the way of kind of an overview and introduction here of the exhibit. For those of you that have been through our main Story of North Carolina exhibit, I'm sure you've noticed that there's Revolutionary War content, Civil War content, but not much after that. And that was really one of the things that we were told to address with this exhibit, because really the Civil War and the Indian War period is the last time that any major conflicts are fought here in the United States on our own soil. From then on out, most conflicts that the United States is involved in are overseas. And that's really the time period that we're looking to address here with Answering the Call. It's going to begin with the Spanish-American War, and eventually it's going to go all the way up through present day. But for the present, this current version of the exhibit ends at the end of World War II. So we're looking at the time period 1898 to 1945. And even though it's a military exhibit, I don't want you to think that it's just going to be about wars. You're not going to come in and get a primer about World War I. There's going to be just enough information in there to set the stage and hopefully provide some background. But what Answering the Call does, it really looks at the people, at the North Carolinians themselves who were involved in these various conflicts. And again, it's not just conflicts, because we look at peacetime service as well. So this is going to look at all of North Carolina's veterans from 1898 to 1945. So we have several periods of non-conflict involved there, the early 1900s after the Spanish War, as well as the interwar period. And we have things that relate to those time periods. So again, it's not just going to focus on wartime experiences. It's peacetime as well as wartime. And like I say, the primary purpose of this exhibit is not to tell you about World War I or World War II. We want you to focus on the people who were there, on the personal stories, on the family stories that bring it home to North Carolina. And I think one of the best physical representations of military service on the home front is what you see on the screen. Hopefully you see on the screen right now is the service flag here. This belonged to the Whitlow family of Caswell County. They had 12 children, 6 of whom would serve in uniform during World War II, 4 sons, 2 daughters. And I'll talk a little bit more about one of their daughters here in just a moment. But on the home front, one of the most visible ways to represent that you had a son or daughter in military service was to hang one of these service flags in your window. The blue stars represent the number of family members who were in service. If there was a gold star on there, that meant that you had a family member who died in service. And this one is kind of unique. You can see it has the 5 stars there in the center. And then when the last son entered military service, they had to add on that other one there at the top. So this one is kind of unique. You don't very often see a lot of family service flags with this many stars on it. And this one clearly shows a later addition to the war effort. If you remember our previous military exhibit, these 2 folks here on the screen probably look familiar to you, Worth Bagley and William Shipp, 2 of North Carolina's biggest war heroes from the Spanish-American War. Worth Bagley was the first naval officer killed during the Spanish-American War. William Shipp was an officer in the 10th U.S. Cavalry who died leading his troops up the slopes of San Juan Hill. alongside of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. We have ship's uniform, we have Bagley's uniform, those will both be included. We also have some other stories from the Spanish-American War that you might not be familiar with. We have some actual original video footage, some of the oldest video footage in history that shows some African-American veterans. I believe they're actually from ship's 10th Cavalry on board transports. There's also some reenactment footage of the attack on San Juan Hill. And when I say reenactment footage, I don't mean, recent reenactment footage. This was taken within about a year or so of when the actual battle occurred. So it is extremely old reenactment footage as well. And one of the things that proved difficult about this exhibit was trying to determine what stories to include. Obviously, you can't tell everybody's story, so you have to pick and choose. And in some ways, we were limited by who and what we had artifacts from. But that we didn't want that to be a completely limiting factor. So not being just tied to the artifacts, we looked for other ways to tell other stories. The video footage that I just mentioned is one of the ways. We also have a series of videos. You might remember the videos that were in the footlockers, the crate videos in our World War I exhibit. We're reusing some of those and also created more to add to that series, telling stories of other veterans who we don't have artifacts for, but we have, in some cases, their original writings. So we have actors portraying other folks, trying to come at telling the story in a little bit different way. And in some areas, primarily World War II, we have some oral histories that will be playing as well. So in that instance, you will actually be hearing from the veteran themselves, describing their wartime service. So again, we're not tied just to the artifacts. When we move forward on our timeline here, after the Spanish-American War, we get into the 19 teens. And while World War I is going on across the Atlantic over in Europe, the United States almost goes to war with Mexico. And even though the United States Army actually did invade Mexico in pursuit of Pancho Villa, there was concern that the border might be left open. Pretty much it was just about the entire regular U.S. Army was down below the border. So they needed somebody back along the Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California border to protect against further raids from not just Villa, but others. This was a very unstable time period in Mexican history. There were quite a few different factions who were vying for control of the Mexican government, and quite a few of them were coming across, and Villa was the main one, but there were other smaller ones as well who were coming across and raiding various border towns. So who's going to protect the border? Well, the National Guard, and North Carolina's National Guard was sent down to the vicinity of primarily El Paso, Texas, but they also crossed into New Mexico as well. And on this photograph, you can see Company D of the 3rd North Carolina Infantry, which I believe was from Lewisburg, encamped out there in the New Mexico desert. And that's a story that we'll tell. In the exhibit, you will meet a guy by the name of Arthur Fletcher, who was a North Carolina National Guardsman, who was also a reporter, a correspondent for the Raleigh News and Observer. So throughout his time period down there on the border, he's sending letters back here to Raleigh that are being published in the newspaper, as well as photographs. There's a huge photograph collection of his across the street at the State Archive. So Fletcher is a very vital resource for telling this story of the North Carolina National Guard's involvement on the border. And moving forward from there, we get into World War I. And there are so many stories from World War I that we could tell. This is one of my favorites. Thomas Bullock from Wilmington, excuse me. He was a veteran of the Spanish-American War, served in the 25th U.S. Infantry during the Pan-Am War and also in the Philippines afterwards. And he joins the Army again in World War I. And there's only a handful of African Americans from North Carolina who are sent to OCS, Officer Candidate School. Bullock is one of them. There was 49 in total from North Carolina that were sent. Just a little bit more than half of them, 27 actually graduated. Again, Bullock was one of them. He was assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division during the First World War, and he becomes the first officer from that division killed in action, September 2nd of 1918. Bullock was a huge hero in Wilmington. There was actually an American Legion post named after him down there in Wilmington. And he's kind of an overlooked figure, but he's starting to get more recognition now. And he is one of the stories that you will meet. Another one is this lady, Lula Owl. She was an Eastern Band Cherokee. She was a huge, huge player in the advancement of medicine in the Qualla Boundary. She was the only Eastern Band Cherokee officer in World War I. She was also, as far as we can tell, the first American Indian to become a registered nurse. She was supposed to go over to Europe with the troops during the First World War, but she got seasick and was not able to go. So they realized that putting her on a boat for a week was probably not the best option. So she was actually sent up to Washington State to an Army fort up there. I believe it was. I forget the name. I don't want to say the wrong information. But while she's up there, she actually meets her future husband, who was also in the service at the time, a fellow by the name of Gloin. And after she gets out of the Army, she comes back to North Carolina and is instrumental in the expansion of medicine to the Cherokee in Western North Carolina. Speaking of nurses, Evelyn Whitlow. When we skip ahead here to World War II, you remember the service flag that I showed you at the beginning of the Whitlow family? Evelyn Whitlow was one of those 6 members of the Whitlow family who joined the United States military during World War II. She was actually the first one to go. She joined the Army Nurse Corps in 1941, and she goes to the Philippines. And she's over there when the Japanese attacked the Philippines on December 8th, 1941. She's captured along with most of the rest of Douglas MacArthur's forces at Bataan and Corregidor in April and May of 1942. She is listed as missing in action in May of 1942, and for 2.5 years, her family has no idea what has become of her. She has absolutely no contact with the outside world. The Japanese were not allowing the Red Cross or other relief agencies to get into the various prisons where the captives from Bataan and Corregidor were being held. And it was not until December of 1944 that the Whitlow family learned that Evelyn was still alive. And she would come back to North Carolina after the war. And she met her husband. He was also, as memory serves, a fellow captive of the Japanese during the war over there. And it was kind of a happy ending to a very sad story there. But she and her husband would go back to the Philippines later. This fellow right here, William Henderson. He was North Carolinian, served in the 28th Marines. He was at Iwo Jima. This is a quote from Henderson that kind of really puts the fighting for Iwo Jima in perspective. When my battalion landed on Iwo on February 19th, we had a total of 1,688 men. When we came off the island, and this would be about a month later, we had 86 men who were not killed in action or wounded. It took 28 ships to bring our division to Iwo. It only took 8 to take them home. Henderson was a lieutenant at Iwo, and after the war, he became one of the founders of North Carolina Zoo. Passed away just a few years ago. We have some of his souvenirs that he brought back from World War II that'll be in the Iwo Jima section of the exhibit. And these last 2 folks, Whitlow and Henderson, as part of the exhibit, we have 2 kind of submersive vignettes. One of them is the Malinta Tunnel on the island of Corregidor, which was a pre-war tunnel that went underneath the mountains there on Corregidor. And when the attack on the island came, being underground was really the only safe place that you could be. So the Malinta Tunnel became a barracks, a supply depot, a hospital, MacArthur's headquarters. Pretty much everything and everybody that was left on the island of Corregidor went into the various parts of the Malinta Tunnel. We have a very small, not to scale, representation of the entrance to the Malinta Tunnel that you will see in the exhibit. And also for Lieutenant Henderson here, we have a much larger Iwo Jima vignette. And one of the macro artifacts, that's definitely the largest artifact in the exhibit, is an original World War II 75 millimeter pack howitzer. The Marines used those not just at Iwo, but at all the islands in the Pacific. It was a very lightweight artillery piece. It was designed to come apart and be transported either by about, I think it was 8 or 10 men, or it could be taken apart and put on mules. It could also be dropped by parachutes. It was a very lightweight but very effective gun. It was used all throughout World War II. It's actually still in use by the U.S. military as well as other countries today. So it's definitely proved its worth and has kept up its usefulness and longevity. The one that we have is on loan from the 82nd Airborne at Fort Bragg. And it's the centerpiece of our Iwo Jima exhibit. You'll see the black sands, which our exhibit design team went to great expense to try and figure out how exactly to recreate the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima. And I believe the result that they've come up with is it's definitely, you'll think it's real. It looks like the real thing. It's a very impressive exhibit there for Iwo. And as part of that, we also have some video footage, some original footage taken from the landing craft, as well as combat footage showing naval artillery, as well as field guns firing on Mount Suribachi. And the whole Iwo vignette is really to try and give you the impression that you're there. Right before you get to Iwo, you'll come through the Navy section. You'll actually be looking out at Iwo through a porthole in the side of the ship. You will see Mount Suribachi off in the distance. Then you come around the corner and boom, there you are on the black sand beaches with video footage playing in the background. So again, we're trying to make it as fully immersive as possible. One of the other things that we've tried to do with the oral history exhibits is space them throughout. So you're hearing the veterans themselves talk about what you're looking at there on the panel with supporting artifacts there from it, trying to give it as much of a human feel as possible. I didn't want this to be your stereotypical military exhibit where you're just looking at map after map and a whole wall full of guns. Figured it would be a lot more effective and really drive home the fact that history happens to real people. So that's one of the things that was behind the stories that I chose, trying to pick different people from different walks of life. Some of them are general officers, some of them are privates in the ranks, some of them will come home from their service, others unfortunately do not. But in pretty much, I feel confident saying in every instance, every person who is featured in this exhibit, their experiences in uniform, whether it was in wartime or in peacetime, their military service had a profound effect on their life, whether it was physical, whether they were wounded, or whether it could be undiagnosed PTSD, or just a greater appreciation for life, basically. And I think in every case, these people were affected by their military service. And in some instances, it affected them when they came home. You can see their wartime service would affect their future career path, or various other ways that it affected their lives. Some of them became community leaders. Some of them became career military officers. There's one gentleman who served in Italy in World War II who's featured. He was so taken aback by his wartime experiences, he turned to religion. He became a minister after the war, and he spent most of the rest of his life going and visiting the families of a lot of his comrades who died there in Italy and did not come home from the war. And he made, I think it was 12 or 15 trips back to Italy to revisit his battlefields, to come to terms with what he had experienced during the war, and also to go visit the families and in some cases, the children of the people who had cared for him during 1944 and 1945 during the fighting over there. So again, in just about every instance, you're going to see that these people were affected by their military service. And that's one of the most important things I think to keep in mind when you're looking at military history is it's not war porn, as a lot of the academics like to call it. There's so much to be learned from studying military conflicts. You're not looking at just various pieces moving on a map. You need to look at the people who were involved, and that's what we've tried to do with this exhibit: is put a human face to the places and the names in the books as much as possible. And I don't have time, of course, to get into all the stories that we have mentioned, but I just wanted to close out here with kind of a photo montage of people. Everybody that you see on the screen here, their story is told in some way, shape, or form in this exhibit. Whether they were, well, we've got a few minutes here. I can tell you at least who these folks are. The guy at top left, George Watts Hill. I'm sure just about everybody's familiar with James Bond and spy stuff. Hill was really the World War II version of that. He worked for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. They were the forerunner of the CIA. So a lot of the spy stuff that you see in the Cold War came about with the OSS during World War II. George Watts Hill from Durham was one of the movers and shakers in the OSS. Bottom left, Millie Dunn Vesey. She was from here in Raleigh. She served in the only all-black, all-female unit in the U.S. Army during the war, the 68th, 88th Postal Directory Battalion. They were in charge of delivering mail from the United States to the troops at the front. They served in England and France during the war. Their unit motto was "No mail, no morale," and the work that they did over there was for decades, just nobody knew about it or nobody cared about it. But when you look at the effect that a letter from home has on that soldier sitting in a foxhole at the front, he needs to know that the people at home are thinking about him, and he needs them to know that he's okay. Millie Vesey and her comrades in the 6888 were the ones who were responsible for making sure that that happened. The lady over here at the top right, Gisela Gross, she was Jewish from Poland. As a teenager, she was involved in the Polish resistance in the first part of the war until she was discovered and was imprisoned in a concentration camp. She was the only member of her immediate family who survived the Holocaust. And you will see her forged identity documents on display and learn a little bit more about her story. And as you enter the exhibit, you're going to see almost life-size cutouts of several soldiers. And the gentleman right here at the center is one of those who will greet you as you make your way into the exhibit. I believe his name is Thomas Pennington. And the little flag down there at the right, that was the car flag of the commander of the North Carolina National Guard during the Second World War. So with that, I will be glad to take some questions if we have any.
Charlie, it looks like we have one in the chat asking about the service flag at the beginning, how large it was, and is that a standard size?
It varies. There was no real standard size, if you will, of service flags. These were made, usually privately made, to display in either the windows of houses or storefronts. They could vary. I'm not sure the size of this one. I want to say it's like 8x5 or so. It's not very big at all. It's about the size of your computer screen. Some of them were enormous. Some companies would produce flags for all of their employees that were in service. Those would get to be 3x5, 4x6. You know, the more stars that were on them, obviously the larger they're going to be. Most of the family ones were fairly small, about the size of your monitor screen there. And this one it's about that size, maybe 4x6 inches, give or take, somewhere in that vicinity. But I've seen ones that are 4 foot by 6 foot and had, you know, around 100 different stars on them.
And we also have a comment in the chat that says, it's great that you're including Lieutenant Bullock. Can you talk more about how you are addressing the systematic segregation and racism in the military in the exhibit?
That's an excellent question. And the way that we're doing it, There are, since the military was segregated at that time, that's how I've treated it in this exhibit for the most part, is there will be, for the World War I and World War II sections, there are sections devoted strictly to African Americans in service, but there are also other Black veterans who are mentioned elsewhere throughout the exhibit as well. And when the second half of this exhibit gets built, after that'll be covering the period after the U.S. military was integrated. So you won't see the segregation reflected there. But in this particular part, there are panels that address how the military was segregated. We tell the stories of not just Bullock and Millie Vesey, but several other African American veterans as well. Unfortunately, when it comes to artifacts, that's one of the areas that we're really lacking. We don't have a lot of artifacts from African American service veterans, so that's something I would definitely like to increase our holdings of. So that was one of the areas where we really had to look to non-artifact ways of telling the stories, and the videos with the modern day actors. Several of those will come into play. I believe one of the characters that's portrayed is a sailor in the Navy B-1 band, which was the first African Americans in the U.S. Navy who were anything other than mess stewards. They were housed at Chapel Hill. There was a huge Navy presence at UNC Chapel Hill during the war. The Navy B-1 band was there. That's one of the stories that will be told in the videos. There's also Vernon Haywood, who was a Tuskegee Airman from here in Raleigh. His story is told. And there are also others, because again, there's only so much space in the exhibit that we can tell. And when we get to where we can put things on the website devoted to this exhibit, there's a lot of other stories that I want to tell. William McBriar, who was a Medal of Honor recipient from North Carolina, his story is absolutely incredible. He received the Medal of Honor for his service in a fight with the Apache out in Arizona, I believe in the 1880s. But he served in the Spanish-American War, Philippine insurrection, and he enlisted several times, and he eventually became an officer. And when World War I broke out, even though McBriar was, God, he had to be, I guess, probably about 50 or so. He tried to re-enlist in the Army in World War I, but they told him he was too old to go. And that's one of the stories that I really like to examine in greater detail on our website, maybe in a blog post or maybe even in a future Coffee with the Curator talk. But we're not limited just to what's in the exhibit. There are other stories that will eventually be told virtually as well. So I hope that answers your question.
And I think we have time for one more, Charlie. We've got someone asking, what do you recommend for those of us who have artifacts from World War II for preservation and for sharing?
You definitely want to take care of your things. This is really more of a conservator question, I think, but you definitely want to keep it in a climate controlled thing. Don't tuck it in a duffel bag and throw it in the basement or the attic and forget about it. It needs to be somewhere climate controlled. Unfortunately, I've almost lost my grandfather's World War II uniform because when he came home, he threw it in his duffel bag and threw it in the attic, and it wasn't seen again for 60 years. And by then it had become pretty dry rotten and the moths had found it. So you definitely want to, even if it's just hanging it up in your closet inside a suit bag, that's better than keeping it wadded up in the 100+ degree temperatures of the attic where it's exposed to bugs. If you actually want to display it, you got several options. Either put it on a mannequin or a hanger, or even a flat board if it's not in the best of shape, displaying it flat on a bit of an angle. But really, the first step to keeping it safe and able for future generations to see it is just keeping it in a climate controlled area.
And we do have some tips on our website about conservation, or you can feel free to contact our conservators at the museum for more information as well.
Oh, and one other thing I wanted to point out, we do have a behind the scenes video of the exhibit showing it under construction, interviews with me and several of our exhibit design staff as well. It's on our Facebook page. It was posted, I think, about 3 or 4 days ago, if you want to take a look at that to actually see what's going on in the gallery itself.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. This has been great, and I hope everybody will be able to come see the exhibit. Charlie, you want to tell us one more time when it opens?
April 6th.
All right. Thank you all very much. Have a great day.